Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes and guests Professors Heather Erb and Steve Bertucci. Professor Erb teaches at Lockwood State University and is on the executive board of the American Maritime Society. And Steve Bertucci is director of the Great Books program at Angelicum Academy, Ignatius Liberal Studies program. We will, though, as always, begin with a prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful, and the same Spirit help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, Mario, could you get us started?
If we have a worldview, then we have a set of texts which are coming out of that worldview. My question is, could the reading of those books rebuild that worldview, since today that view of classical realism is completely gone?
Okay.
Can we recreate that world today from the situation in which we live in?
Do you want me to handle this one? I'll jump in here.
Sure, go ahead, Heather.
Right. Well, this is, of course, the problem of the perennial wisdom. The very word perennial, there's a claim there that there is, objective reality, and that the human being is, has a nature that is made in order that can access that, and that we can know that without revelation, that we can reach that, through knowledge of the natural law and philosophical anthropology. As for facing down, if you will, the postmodern disintegration, really, of knowledge and human wisdom, I think that although we don't have a course, we don't assign one of these postmodern books in order to study it and understand that. But I think if we did have such a book on the syllabus, it would be used as be quite an easy foil to show. It would be very easily exposed for the incoherent, relativistic, ultimate nihilism that it is. And so, how to go about rejigging the realist worldview is simply by presenting the text to those who really maybe aren't poisoned by the postmodern worldview, at least in an educational context. Our culture is, unfortunately, it's gained great traction in Western culture, far beyond academe, Mario. So I'm not sure if you're addressing this disintegration of the realist worldview within academe or outside it, and that would depend. My answer would depend on that.
Well, if I could jump in here, a couple of things.
Sure.
It's a great question. Because I'm sometimes asked, by prospective students, isn't it the case, they'll say, that in these so-called great books, there is not everything that's presented in there is true. There's lots of error. And, well, that's absolutely the case. And I think this is part of Mario's question. It recognizes this. In our particular program, there are different approaches to what we would call a great books programs. There's about 100 or so, the last I heard, of great books programs in colleges around the country. Some of them are only 2 semesters long. There aren't very many that are a full 4 years. But in those programs that take a chronological approach, such as ours, the students are introduced to, and they encounter, for instance, Plato and Aristotle before they ever encounter Locke and Hume and these people who, in effect, deny formal and final causes to things, where nothing becomes coherent after that. But our students are first introduced, and in this order of discovery, they encounter Plato and Aristotle first. Now, it's true that eventually, these students on these questions are going to have to make up their own minds about these things, and one of the things, at least in my view, that this great books experience gives them, it gives them some tools and some understanding, some grounding in principles that enable them to dissect all these later errors that they're going to encounter, and which, as Mario noted, are just rampant today.
Yes, I have a follow-up question about that. One of the things that I noticed is that the Great Book curriculum generally is implemented in homeschooling education. Now, if I'm correct, perhaps I'm not, homeschooling is an environment which is quite different from any public school today, and where the kids already have been living in such a way which is completely different from the culture in general. So they are more open to receive the Great Book teaching, so to speak. In other words, for them, the worldview precedes the learning of the Great Books, so that they can somehow then start analyzing, weighing the argument of those great books easily, that if you teach those great books in a public environment. So, do you think that the great book teaching will be as effective, if you will, in a public environment? Or we need to start from just this control, if I can use this bad word, homeschooling curriculum?
Well, I'm going to defer here to Heather. I think she can address this perhaps better than I can, because she teaches in both environments. She teaches in our classrooms where, as Mario notes, most of the students, not all, because we get students from all over the world, but most of the students, we are fortunate, those of us who teach in the program, we're fortunate to have the student body that we have. These students, again, as Mario noted, have, for the most part, received a good formation. They already believe in the notion that there is such a truth, that there is such a thing as truth, that it is that is knowable, and so on. And so that's one great advantage that I think in our classrooms is we don't spend a lot of time, in fact, hardly any time on the questions of, is there such a thing as truth? There are some Great Books programs who start with a totally open slate, and it's very difficult to make, in my opinion, to make a great deal of progress in that kind of environment. But Heather teaches in what we might call public environment with the kinds of students, and she also teaches in our classroom. So I think she could speak well to this question of the kind of approach. See, I see it more as a question of pedagogy than necessarily a great books question, because all these questions that we encounter, what we talk about in our program principally, common human experience, common human ideas. Well, in the public forum, if we want to call public school that forum, public university that forum, those are the same ideas, common human experience, common human ideas that they discuss. And it would seem to me it's principally, if you have a well-trained, I'll call this person, rather than a teacher, a moderator, a well-trained, a well-formed moderator, that person using this Socratic approach, this questioning approach, and understanding what we might call learning as in the order of discovery, that person can have a great impact in the public, what we might call the public classroom. But Heather, what would you say about that?
Well, I would say, the birth of these programs, of course, we were talking whatever 50, 70 years ago, was in a public environment. University of Kansas, Columbia, these are public, secular environments at any rate. And they flourished there, but of course people were formed by largely Judeo-Christian worldview in that time period. So there was more openness to it. But I would say a couple of things regarding this. Regarding the public environment today, a public university, not a particularly privileged one, let's say, an average one, as Steve noted, we're dealing with human nature no matter where we are. So it's really a matter of peeling back some of the misconceptions and what John Sr. would call, the malformation of the imagination. So the same tools, you can do maybe pieces of the great books. I find that this works ideally to lead them into, greater reading, research projects, however we're going to get at it. You have to be much more flexible because there isn't that, parental guideline, let's say, going on, and often they're being advised in the wrong way by their other teachers. But I think that we've reached a point in the culture with even the average student that they have reached the rock bottom of this postmodernism, this celebration of disunified diversity. They know this is meaningless without any kind of proper concept of a common human nature. And so we're dealing with human beings in any situation. But I think in the public university, while we can't turn on that syllabus full throttle, we can certainly lead them, as I do, into the consideration of the great books, first of all by little snippets, and then supplementing it with argument, because they've been taught, argument is the only way to truth, if they believe in truth at all. But also the way of art. You have to supplement this with art. You've got to capture their imagination in any way you can. Art, music, snippets, lead them into the Socratic dialectic, and I think we're at a point in the culture where the student, let's say, disencumbered by a rigidly politicized faculty, will go forward. And I've seen it happen. So there is a great amnesia in education, but we have to get at the student beneath the system and, set them out to sail with a compass and a map towards happiness and the ability to judge the true and the good versus evil.
Yeah,
so I would say that, Mario. I don't know if that's not a complete answer, but it's a little bit.
Well, one other thing I would, if I may, jump, just cut me off if any time you want to.
Sure, go ahead.
But something Heather, again, touched on there, she speaks of human nature, and she's absolutely right, that it all, in any time we speak of education, we have to look at it in light of what it is being educated, and it's a human being, a human person. And there is this, education is not simply an intellectual pursuit. We do have this affective side to our nature, and students, let's say, who have not received a good formation, they still are filled with all these sense experiences that they've had throughout their lives, although now we have this, I'm not sure how to characterize it, this disaster of video screens that people carry with them everywhere, so they become more disassociated from this direct encounter with nature by sense experience. But I guess one way to illustrate it is, for instance, in that public classroom, if you were to ask the students, what is a star? And just begin with that, and they will eventually, at least in my experience, they'll say, well, it's a flaming ball of gas. And then you could quote to them, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
Of that.
Up above the world so high, like a flaming ball of gas. No, it's like a diamond in the sky. Now, is that a real human experience? Is that principally, in fact, how students, regardless of their formation, experience the stars, like diamonds in the sky? So there are different ways to know things. Do we know stars principally as flaming balls of gas? Well, we might say intellectually, but in terms of our sense experience, there are those who would argue, well, they really are more like diamonds in the sky. And the reason I mention that is I mentioned earlier that there are different approaches to the great books. It's really more proper to say there are different approaches to education. We begin each of our classes in the great books with poetry because that tends to awaken this affective side of human nature that, particularly in the young, in a way, can be dominant in their lives. They aren't the young. One of the things that characterizes them is they are not so. How would I put this? Their lives aren't principally lives of intellectual experience, but they're principally lives of affective experience. And one of the jobs of education is to integrate these things. Anyway. Using this, keeping in mind this affective side of human nature, at least in my view, is really, really important, and perhaps more so in the public classroom.
How's about, since both of you have given us already a very full picture of the spirit of great books and great books education, how's about if I poke around a little bit? Because certainly over its history in the United States, the Great Books program has been sharply criticized. So let me offer a few criticisms and see what you make of them. Let me begin with the criticism of many that the focus on the West is really problematic. You'd mentioned just a couple minutes ago, Steve, that oftentimes your work begins with poems. In one of the centuries-long classical periods in China, the whole of civil service was decided by way of a series of poetry contests. If you were a civil servant in China, it's not because your father was or because the village had decided you should be, but it was rather because you'd undergone a state-structured, formal, lengthy education, the primary public expression of which was poetry. And that's how you came to be a civil servant. Now, given centuries-long traditions like that, you think that Adler and Van Dorn were right to give such emphasis to the West?
Well, I think so, but principally for the same reason that I think, I'll speak here of the young, it's more important for a young person to learn his way around, become familiar with his own house, the home he lives in, than he ought to become familiar with the neighbor's house. And certainly he ought to be more familiar with his, just from, if only from a practical order, familiar with his own neighborhood than a neighborhood, 10 miles away. So I think the study of the Western great books is certainly the place to start if you live in the West. Well,
here, let me do a dance on that.
Okay.
Here I am in Inglewood, California, 2 National Football League teams. We call ourselves Concussion City. But here in Los Angeles, where Inglewood is really ensconced, here in Los Angeles, if you walk up and down most streets in most of the city, you mostly don't see the people you saw where I grew up, or people like the people where I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Anglos, as we called ourselves in Texas, where I also did time, Anglos are a distinct minority. You walk the streets of Los Angeles, you're more likely to hear Spanish or Korean, and you walk the streets of Glendale, you're as likely to hear Armenian. And if you were to go to Berkeley, Bertucci. If you were to go to Berkeley, if you're Dutch, Irish, English, like my own not-so-sweet self, you'd be a cultural minority. So there are whole chunks of the United States where your next-door neighbors aren't really going to be, well, you yourself, never mind your next-door neighbors, you yourself are going to be polyglot and polyethnic, and, well, what about that? We've got demographics. You know, once upon a time there was this fellow named Dobie Gillis who had a girlfriend.
And Maynard G. Krebs.
Right, and Zelda kept telling Dobie, propinquity, Dobie, propinquity. Yeah. Well, now we say demographics. We're in Los Angeles, we're mostly not West.
Well, my principal reaction to this, and I'm going to turn to Heather, is that for me, Western civilization is essentially Christian civilization, and Christianity is polyethnic. There's a distinction to be made, I would say, between, although they're certainly related, between civilization and culture. Within Western civilization, you have all kinds of cultures, and it's a fine thing to be familiar with, say, French culture as opposed to English culture, Greek culture as opposed to Russian culture, and or Asian culture, although that's, I don't know if we can even use that word Asian culture because there are so many cultures in Asia. So that would be my first response. It has to do with, again, essentially Western civilization becoming Christian civilization, that Christianity is polyethnic. But Heather, how would you respond to this?
Well, I would, definitely I'd emphasize what you did, not to simplify Western culture the way it has been simplified, derided, and so on. It's just a false vision of the actual, physical scope of Western culture. And as you said, I think that the Judeo-Christian emphasis is important there. Is it connected to realism in some ways? The answer there. I think, first of all, it's interesting that, Adler himself, we don't have time, I think, to go into this today, but he wrestled with this. And he was, of course, on the defense at different points with respect to this very question. And he first of all says, well, Western, until, he's talking about the West anyway, he says until the 19th century, there's simply no great books written by women, blacks, or non-Europeans. He says that doesn't make those that were written by white males in earlier centuries any less great. So, first of all, to kind of acknowledge the dynamic, which is really pitted against the West, is a caricature, really, of what's gone on in the West. That's important. Secondly, Steve was talking about the affective dimension, the way of the heart, and how that is, I guess John Senior would have called that the poetic work that needs done before a student can even build character and then approach the great arguments. I mean, there's an order here. There's a propedeutic order. But in the West, we have something that the East has not been known for. Jim, you were talking about poetry. That's wonderful. But we do have this logocentrism, if you will. Let's understand that in a more positive way. In the West, the development of the great conversation. And that great conversation is a civilization of the dialogue. This is what Hutchins said. And he says it's the only civilization in which a free man would want to live. So there's this issue of the logos that is really given attention, is put at the forefront in the Western tradition through argumentation and embedded concepts and literature and so forth, through which we come to understand ourselves and understand freedom. In other words, the Western approach, if you will, has great explanatory power that some philosophers have argued the East simply doesn't have. Adler, in his book on religion, for example, and truth, he's quite clear that in the East there's an entirely different role for the notion of truth. The very notion of truth in Eastern religion is more therapeutic than it is theoretical or speculative. So I'm not ready to make this claim, but I think that what I would say is that the West seems to explain itself better. We can have the great conversation, the great dialogue that isn't as possible in being faithful to the text in the East the way they're written. So
that's certainly very helpful, and the caricatures of the West are certainly to be exposed. I think you're absolutely right there. But let me push a little bit more, and then I'm going to invite Mario back into the discussion. Once upon a time, there was a Jesuit. There always is, isn't there? Once upon a time, there's a Jesuit named Matteo Ricci. And evidently, he came from a small city that my wife and I recently had the delightful privilege of visiting, Urbino in Italy. Well, Ricci wanted to connect with the Chinese, and I'm certainly no historian of this, but the impression I get is that Ricci mostly emphasized Western technology. And the emphasis on Western technology paid off to a certain extent. Chinese leaders were mightily impressed. But one thing led to another, and there was a debate about whether the main term used for heaven by the Chinese mandarins, whether that could be equated with God. And Dominicans and Franciscans said, no, it can't. It really, really, really can't. And Ricci said, oh, yes, it really, really can. And the Holy See decided that no, it really can't. And so the break there in Ricci's efforts, such as they were, was ultimately on a basic point of theology. It's not enough to wax mightily technologically. You have to address these very, very, very core issues. Now, I mention this just as an aside, and I mention it not to scandalize anyone, but it wasn't denied when I raised it among a group of Jesuits. I have read that Ricci was loath to say to the leading figures in China that Christ died on a cross. This was something that had to be saved for maybe later generations, whereas you have Paul saying, I preach Christ and him crucified. Well, so what I'm saying is there are any number of factors that come into play in addressing the Chinese. Now, along comes another Jesuit, Archbishop Spadaro, who currently has been in China and said things about Chinese life and culture that are, not to put too fine a point on it, preposterous. This idea that China somehow exemplifies Christian social teaching is an absolute grotesquerie. And so this whole question now is, how is it that we connect with China and India as Christians if we're going to locate the Great Books program within the context of Christianity? Because Christianity has really only marginally and episodically connected with Indian culture and Chinese culture. And it seems to me that the way forward is more likely to be through looking for great books in China and looking for great books in India than it is waving our technological skills around and making nice politically when the political situation is so disastrous. So to that end, and then I really have to be quiet, to that end, John Paul II and others have stressed that Western philosophy has lost, to a large extent, its sapiential role, its wisdom role. Whereas if you look at, say, Confucianism and Taoism and Hinduism as well, there certainly is Buddhism, there certainly is a distinct sapiential role. So maybe this whole business really is very important for the canon and the great books. What is there sapiential that's enduring in the East that we could in the West familiarize ourselves with? End of rant for the day.
Well, I'll tackle this first. I have a couple of points here. You've had Peter Redpath, who he also...
Oh, we know the lad. Have you seen his ties? Have you seen his neckties?
I have seen a very great deal of Peter, actually. But he's been teaching in our classrooms for, 15 years or so.
And he visits our podcast regularly. Wonderful fellow.
Yeah. Well, as Heather was speaking a little bit ago about this question of, nowadays they call it multiculturalism and diversity and all of that, I was reminded of in our lower grades, middle school and even grade school, one of the things that the students read are what we call folk tales from around the world. And these are stories from different cultures in Africa, different cultures throughout Asia, Russia, just every culture, just cultures from all around the world. And they all have one thing in common that the students discover, that they're always stories about human beings behaving well or behaving badly, and people becoming angry, and people suffering, and people being joyful. And it reminded me of, as Peter says, that philosophy begins in sense wonder. So that brings us back to this another common thing in human nature, is this affective side of nature. You can reach people on that level, regardless of the culture. You look at one way to think of those questions you're asking is to think of the great missionaries, Christian missionaries, the ones who are successful. How did they approach people that lived in these cultures that were wildly different from the Christian culture that these missionaries were bringing to them? Well, I would say principally they loved them. And it's a question that can be asked about Christ himself. The people who embraced Christ, who believed in him, did they do that first because they considered all of his words, logos, or did they do it principally first, where they first moved to embrace him because he loved them and they knew it?
Yes.
So in regard to, again, how do we approach, for instance, the Chinese or some other culture that isn't a Christian culture, I would say first, principally, we love them. And you meet them on the level of human nature, the common ground of human nature. And as to how to do that, well, that's a long story, but I want to turn to my colleague Heather to see what she would have to say in response to your really good question. And you're right, too, that this has been, I've heard it for 20 years now, it has been a criticism of the great books, that as if it's exclusionary, and I wouldn't use that word. It's not exclusionary, but as Heather noted,
focused.
Yeah, you're not going to find a great many, at least to my knowledge, of what we might call the Eastern great books. If they're out there, I hope someone will put them together, and I'm sure there'd be profit in studying them. But anyway, Heather, I'm going on too much.
No, that's fine. Okay, can you guys hear me? Is it?
Yes, you sound good.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, great.
And we're listening for Mario. Don't forget him.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Mario, did you want to ask something at this point, or add on, or I'll just keep going here?
Well, the only thing that I can say, I completely agree with Steve, what he said about the heart. And just a side comment, I knew pretty well Professor Quinn when he was in his Dennis Quinn, and we have the same love for the Latin tradition, the Latin Mass, and when I was doing my doctorate at KU. And so what I see here, looking at the reflection you have been making about the West, I see in this way, the West is not a geographical civilization. The West is more a spirit, a way of looking at reality. Looking at reality, which includes reason, not the reason comes from modernity, rather than a broader reason, faith to our destiny, freedom, and ultimately democracy. And so that's the spirit of the West. Now, today, many regions of the East geographically are Western in spirit. By the same token, we can argue that many thinkers which were born in the West were not Western in that spirit. I'm thinking about the totalitarian philosopher Marx and many others. So in that sense, we don't make the Western tradition an ideology, which is sometimes what hurt, I think, that term and that view. Western civilization, a civilization which entail all the beauty of reality and so on. I think it's more open in that sense. If you can say more fluid in certain ways, yes. Now, geographically, yes, the West is born in a particular places. There is no question about it, Greece, and you can go to the people of Israel and so on. In that sense, I think we can include in this spirit some educational in China, which began with poetry and so on. So I think the term is more elastic, if you will, it's more open, and it begins with the heart. Begin with the heart of the person. And because the person is the one who raised question about beauty, about justice, about freedom, etc., etc. So that in that sense, we share the same common humanity. And I think if we use the text as an instrument or use, I think, you mentioned this, some of you mentioned the word the trigger of book or trigger of opportunity to see this reality. I think that is very appropriate. Now, having said that, sometimes I have some issue with the canon, which books really are a trigger or open our hearts. Because there are many books which are included sometimes in this canon are not, I think, blockers sometimes. And I mentioned, I think a week ago, I mentioned Francis Bacon, Descartes, which is somehow they try to put away or put aside these books and just look at your own mind and your own thinking and start from there. So that's, I don't know, it's a question, it's my reflection about what you have said.
Go ahead, Heather. You were going to speak to
yes.
Jim's question. You might. There's a lot there that Mario said that, gosh, I'm so glad he said it. Maybe you'd want to respond to that as well. Heather? Oh, did we lose her?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Oh, there she is.
Yes, we can.
Okay,
she was on mute, and she didn't unmute. This is a hazard.
Thanks to Western technology. So I agree with a lot of what Mario said. I think we have to be careful regarding the West, particularly today, in order to have a healthy sense of reason, of logos, and really not be ashamed of that. Yes, we have the way of the heart, but the real story of the Western conversation is coming to an articulation of the interaction between the will and the intellect, and to be able to understand that and to articulate it and to see how it's been, people have fallen off the path, or, you mentioned Descartes, you mentioned Bacon, the great precursor to Dewey's errors in terms of utilitarianism as, the goal of life, utilitarian view of happiness and education itself. So, but I think that there is a balance there. There's a great balance and a great articulation, a self-conscious articulation, along opposite lines. And this is what we have in the great books syllabus, if you will, the students are not kind of like, rigidly formed according to one view, but trusted in their humanity to reach the truth for themselves and their own particular living out of that truth. They have to live it out, carry it forward. So meeting with other cultures, Eastern as opposed to Western in terms of the spirit of what that means, great distinction there. It's not geographic at all. There is the person-to-person meeting, and then there's the question of inclusion in a curriculum, and those are two levels of discussion. And so I think the secondary one, the curricular inclusion, and what is a great book, that's the real rub. It's not the person-to-person. I mean, I think people have recognized, post-Enlightenment reason has gone awry. It's debased the human being through, human nature becoming a matter of something to be manipulated, the service of a, disorientated will, if you will. So the real question is this inclusion in a curriculum. And Steve said, it would be great if the East could put, people over there could put forward great books as a curriculum, and that would be fine. And I think that if you see Frederick Cobblestone, another Jesuit, if we're talking about Jesuits, he was fascinated with this, and he spoke about Shankara versus Ramanuja and the Hindu tradition. But when you get into those debates, as opposed to the poetry, as opposed to the mysticism, when you get into the debates, they're along the lines of the validity of discursive reasoning and Western categories. So how and what ought to be included would be an interesting discussion to have, whether it should be along the lines of philosophical and religious debates. Jim mentioned the meaning of God and ultimate reality across different traditions, or should it be but an effective kind of approach where we read, Rumi's poetry in Islam, or we read Shankara, or we read them as non-critically, let's say. So that's an interesting topic to consider. Why they weren't included, I think there was enough to do in the West. And this notion of the great, there was enough to do in the West, and we have this idea of the role of logos in human development, and even though it has been derailed, so to speak, into technology alone, and we could talk about the whole history of that and what Dewey did with his experimental method. I don't think we will, but so what is the remedy? We can include Eastern works, but I think we'd have to be careful how we do that and with what criteria and with what end in mind, because it could backfire. It could be something which is viewed by Easterners themselves as a kind of a reduction of their tradition. So I agree with Steve. They would have to do it themselves.
Well,
but, sorry, Steve?
No, go ahead. I thought you were finished there. I was just going to add one thing, but please, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more small point, which is to understand the full scope of reason as part of the remedy or corrective. And, reason has many orders. It has a fourfold order. And so to understand, I think that to have a grasp of that in Aristotle and Aquinas, the scope of reason, first of all, has a contemplative dimension of beholding what already is. Then it can arrange concepts within itself in epistemology, logic. It can deliberate. It can put an order into our acts of will and love, and it's used to make things. So to understand, as Adler understood so well, the various tasks of reason is the beginning of a remedy and understanding the true contribution of Western philosophy, if you will, in the great books and formation of the person. Okay, I'm going to give it to Steve.
Well, just comment here, because as I'm listening to you, I've become fearful that I may have maybe misunderstood on one point about this affective side of the person. Your emphasis there, Heather, on the logos is really key in a way. At the very beginning of the conversation today, we'd mentioned education, the proper ends of education. Well, in one sense, we might say that the ultimate end, education ought to serve the ends of the human person. And what's the end of the human person? Well, the beatific vision. And is that an affective experience, or is that an intellectual experience principally? It's an intellectual experience principally. And so it's important to keep what Heather, at least in my opinion, what Heather said there in mind, this emphasis, or in a way I think I have emphasized this affective side of the human person. The reason for that is that's the beginning. If we recall in the Symposium de Altima, as she explains the way of love to Socrates, you begin with sense experience, but the end in view, that's just the way. The end in view, where does it all culminate? In this direct union with love itself. And so that distinction that she's making there between the West and the East on the logos, the word, discourse, and that sort of thing, I think is very important. I didn't want to be misunderstood as to be saying that this affective side of the human person is something, the end in view. It's really a means to the end.
Balance and integration. Now, let me interrupt for a minute or three to get us situated. We don't have to, gentle auditors and generous participants, we don't have to limit ourselves to an hour because we're a podcast. And we did have some technical difficulties getting started. And because of that, I want to have as our penultimate discussion statement of just what counts as a great book, because in a way we've circled over that. But let me say, if we can go for, let's say, another 10 minutes, let me raise one more criticism that people might make of the Great Books program, and then let me have one response to this emphasis on love, and then how's about, if Mario has something to add, that's for sure welcome, but how's about then, Steve and Heather, you tell us something specific about the Angelicum program. So, to start with, we've talked a good deal about human nature, and we've spoken a lot about the same thing, using bigger words, philosophical anthropology. And we've talked about shared human nature and the like. Suppose someone says, and there's always someone who will say such a thing in one way or another, and the student might say it without recognizing quite how much is being said. Suppose someone says, well, to talk about human nature supposes that there are different and distinctive kinds of being. And as I come to read Locke and Hume, maybe even here in my Great Books curriculum, I come to wonder whether there are such clean-cut divisions among kinds. And somebody maybe in the back row says, yeah, let me give you a for instance. A lot of the people in this class are really more into animals. And, in terms of affectivity, a whole lot of people love their pets and say such things under their breath as, I love my pet more than I love the people in this class. And furthermore, a whole lot of us are really heavy into sci-fi. And I even read a book, says one student, about transhumanism. And suppose then, after a good discussion, somebody says, well, there really isn't such a thing as human nature if you're going to focus on the species Homo sapiens. There's something that we might call of great interest that includes at least the higher hominids, ourselves, and the technology that we've developed, which technology seems to be supplanting ourselves. And so we're going to have to, if we talk about great books, and human nature talk about human nature transcending itself first and foremost and most visibly in terms of technology. And so how might you address that line of questioning?
Do you want to go first, Heather?
It's your call. Whichever. Do you want to go first?
Well, I'd rather listen to you than listen to me. So why don't you go ahead and...
you're a rare man, Steve. You're a rare man. Given an opportunity to mansplain.
Here's the reason behind that, and Jim will and Mario will understand this. In our classroom, so here I go. This one point, you asked what's distinctive about the Angelicum Academy's Great Books program. Well, one thing that's distinctive, there are other things, is that we have two moderators in each of our classes. So Heather and I spend, I don't know how many hours together we have spent in the classroom, but it's a lot. So I have learned it's not a bad thing to defer to Heather. So go ahead, Heather.
Oh, all right. Well, okay. This line of thinking, and I think it's you're giving a lot of different points there. A basic, I wouldn't even call it a postmodern line of thinking. It's just a sort of what do these guys call it? Expiring in the lazy, helpless drift of things.
Great. What
of absolute uncertainty where nothing is true or right or wrong. This is what we meet when we go into the public classroom in public universities today, where people have not had the formation. So anything can come up, including all of these ideas about, my favorite is when a student in an honors class looks at me square in the eye and said, I don't understand why a rock can't think. And
then breaks into Rock of Ages.
Wanting a clear argument for that. So yes, we have the horses being let out of the barn. But I think that how we respond to all of these things is to understand them first of all as desires of the human heart. Where are they coming from? Not to just I believe that the Great Books teachers know that if all we do is give arguments and teach people how to be arguers, we're really teaching them how to be sophists because they don't know the purpose of their argument. So we have to see where their statements are coming from. And inevitably, unless they're just being trivial and rebellious, they're coming from a deep desire of the human heart. The pet thing is a desire for communion. It's a desire for love. It's a desire to be loved and to affirm the kernel of truth in whatever error they walk in with. So I think that's, first of all, our job. We have to start with that and then take that little kernel and try to lead them to the greater and more noble truths that they're really attached to and to have them sort out the errors for themselves. So that's education, right? Educo, leading out. And so how we would answer the question, though, about human nature is to often, if you're talking about a practicality, to present them with the reductio ad absurdum. What happens if you don't believe you are a body-soul composite? What does it mean to not be human? I think the desire for human transcendence is innate. People, by the fact that they seek communion with others, they are self-transcenders. So the key is to get them to place that desire within a proper ordering of their minds, their wills, their passions, their actions, and to make that journey together, to make it with others. That's the desire. So we've got to, and I think we do that in the Great Books program. It's easier there because there's more people with similar background. So as for self-transcendence, they need to be brought into the awareness through texts and conversation and art and all sorts of things, and reflection on their own personal experience, that certain actions are more perfect than others. So, and those imminent actions which perfect the person themselves are the most perfect acts. So I think that it's not an easy answer. I've just begun to address that, really, but Steve, do you want to add to that? I could add a lot more, but that's just a start.
And don't forget Mario there. You might want to subtract something.
Well, it's very interesting. Just side question regarding this, and I think perhaps I'm out of the topic, but how do you think that the great book may help to form the conscience of someone who is involved in a political party?
Well, Mario's involved in a political party, so be careful how you answer that.
My point is that some people have argued that the great book may form people and they remain completely uncommitted to the public sphere because they are enjoying themselves in contemplating the great ideas. And yet the world, which is more active, is going through a different direction. So my question is, does this type of education help people to form their consciousness so that they are more aware of what is happening in the public sphere?
Well, my first thing I thought of was, can virtue be taught? There's a question we've all heard. And here, it's a question of, at least in part, of formation, of course, but I would say the question of justice might lie at the root of this when we talk about political responsibilities, which what we really, at least seems to me, what we're really talking about there is human relations in community, and what is a just order of human relations in community. Well, this gets to be a moral question, and the more one encounters, both through his reading and his daily life, these questions of moral behavior, do good, the fundamental principle, do good, avoid evil. Well, where does the good lie? People of goodwill in any particular situation can disagree about where the good lies and what would be the proper action in this case. And as far as the great books, again, they're simply, in my view, they're tools. They're great tools because, as Pope Benedict mentioned, they're filled with these thoughts throughout the last several thousand years of this great conversation of, let's look at Scripture. Scripture is full of stories of people doing bad things and people doing good things, and it provides a great opportunity for discussion about these things. And it's that, again, going back to the Logos, this conversation that familiarizes people with common human ideas and common human experience. And as Heather just noted, there aren't any what I would call clear formulas. So many people, not just in education, but in all areas of life, they want formulas. Do A, B, and C, and you'll get D. Well, with human persons, it's not as simple as that. We eventually simply get to principles, and the better we understand these principles and the consequences of principles, the more we'll be able to see, as Mario suggests, in the political sphere, so it seems to me, proper order, what is a disorder and what is proper order. So ultimately I would say yes, the great books, a great books experience in a program that's well run and that has well-formed and educated moderators can definitely help people not only to recognize that they have responsibilities to other persons, but to know what those responsibilities are. Now, regarding an explication of what a proper ordering of human relations in community is, well, that's another question.
All right. Well, that's certainly very helpful. Let me ask one more question, and then I'd like to ask Heather and Steve to restate, as we come to the end of the podcast, what a great book is, and why Judith Krantz never wrote one. And then we'll close with a reading from today's liturgy. The question I want to ask is certainly connected with the whole message of Jesus, and certainly connected with the history of the church, and certainly connected with what's been happening in the last century, and connected with love. When we speak of love, and when we speak of love in a distinctively Christian way, and when we look at the people who brought the gospel initially to China and Japan and Uganda and Korea, doesn't it seem to be the case that those who loved well were martyred? And when we look for success, well, God's name, and certainly not Jesus' name, God's name is not success. And so often there was Steve mentioned the business about a formula. So often what love leads us to is giving our lives for others. And that's probably not something that you raise funds for educational programs. But nonetheless, that seems to me to be a distinctively Christian dimension. Well, at any rate, can you end, and I ask the two of you to join forces, with one more statement of what the Great Books is, and then I'll close with the gospel from today's liturgy.
I defer, Heather.
Oh, you rascal.
Oh, is she there? Did we lose Heather?
Well, she has a way of...
No, I'm here.
Oh,
she drifts in and out, and she told us about that.
Drifting in the postmodern malaise. No,
that reminds me of...
Oh, okay.
Well, no,
right,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Okay, so we have the great books, and we're really talking here about the great books of Western culture, but the great books are the living thread, a kind of a by which we can have ourselves and the students that we work with enter into this great conversation concerning universal and perennial truths about human nature, about society, about ethics, about God, and even reality itself. And these works express really the foundations of Western culture, and through reading them together, we have what's called a living meditation, and that we perform this in common, through which we can learn to join our hearts and minds, our wills and our intellects together, and to understand those perennial questions, perhaps even more than the answers that we end up with. So that's a very short summary. Without going into Adler's various criteria, those are some of the very general things that the great books can do for us. Steve?
Thank you.
Yes, and I would say one of the great benefits of a Great Books program properly done is that one of the prime benefits that comes to students might even be the primary benefit is a recognition of one's own ignorance. As Dr. James Taylor likes to say, ignorance is a prerequisite for learning. Mm-hmm. It's often the case that, I don't know if you've ever run into this, where students think they know more than they do. Little story about the teenager who, when he was 35, was amazed at how much his dad had learned in all that time. So this is a great benefit, particularly to teenagers, to discover their own ignorance, because once they're there and they realize it and see it, now they're ready to learn. In fact, now they're ready in a real way for a lifetime of learning. So the great books are tools to help us achieve the proper ends of liberal education. And that includes not just the natural end of the human person, but his supernatural ends as well. And it all has to do with love. Loving the right things and loving them in the order they ought to be loved. One last note here about what is a great book. Mario mentioned earlier about he used the word the great books canon, and probably if you looked at all the reading lists of the great books, all the different great books programs, there's probably about an 80% consensus on what ought to be included, but the other 20%, there's disagreement on. For instance, I have no idea why Adler did not include Boethius in the Britannica Great Book set.
Probably because he never did jail time himself.
Anyway, so my last point would be that one about, because it's just hit home with me so much, a recognition of my own ignorance. I think that's it's the wisdom of Socrates. So I think that's the terrific benefit for students.
Well, thanks to both of you, Heather and Steve. You've been marvelous guests. We'll close, as we usually do, with a reading from today's liturgy. This is from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus addressed this parable to the Pharisees and scribes. What man among you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, would not leave the 99 in the desert and go after the lost one until he finds it? And when he does find it, he sets it on his shoulders with great joy, and upon his arrival home he calls together his friends and neighbors and says to them, "Rejoice with me because I have found my lost sheep." I tell you, in just the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who have no need of repentance. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks again.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.